House of Murashu. When wealth outlasts gods and kings, a 20 by 10 foot room in Nippur, May 1893, the University of Pennsylvania expedition clears rubble from a collapsed building when a worker's hand touches clay. Within hours, 730 tablets emerge from the debris. More will follow. By the time the dust settles, 879 cuneiform documents will have surfaced, each one a transaction, a lease, a loan, a tax receipt. The tablets span 50 years from 455 to 403 BCE, and they document something remarkable. Not the rise and fall of kings, not the wars between Persians and Greeks. They document what endures when empires change hands. They document the machinery of wealth. The tablets belong to the House of Murashu. The name means wildcat in Akkadian, transliterated from the cuneiform Murashu. 3 generations operated under this name during the reigns of Persian kings Artaxerxes I and Darius II. The firm dealt in agricultural land management, tax collection, and credit extension in the fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates. 50 miles south of where the House of Egibi had operated in Babylon, the Murashus built a parallel fortune using parallel methods. But where the Egibis served kings, the Murashus served landowners. Where the Egibis managed property for soldiers, the Murashus leased land from Persians who refused to live in the hot, disease-prone Babylonian countryside. The difference was not in principle, it was in client base. Money follows the same patterns regardless of the names above palace gates. The House of Murashu proved this. Like the Egibis, they positioned themselves at the friction point between resource owners and resource users. But their method was more aggressive, their legal positioning more creative, and their end more abrupt. The archive they left behind is a lesson in how wealth grows under certain conditions and withers when those conditions shift. It is also a bridge. The Murashu tablets end just as the Persian Empire begins its terminal decline, just before Alexander remakes the world. What the Murashus understood about wealth and power would not die with them. It would simply find new vehicles, new empires, new names. The Murashus operated in an economy structured by Persian conquest. After Cyrus the Great took Babylon in 539 BCE and his successors consolidated control, the Persian administration distributed land across Mesopotamia as payment and incentive. These were bowlands, military fiefs granted on condition of service and tax payment. A Persian nobleman received acreage near Nippur in exchange for providing soldiers when the empire called. The system worked in theory. In practice, it created a logistics problem. Persian elites did not want to manage Babylonian estates personally. The region was hot, malarial, distant from the centers of power in Susa and Persepolis. They wanted income without presence. The House of Murashu offered exactly that. The firm leased land and water rights from these Persian landowners. They would contract for fields, canals, and irrigation infrastructure, agreeing to pay fixed rents to the owners. Then they farmed the land themselves or sublet it to tenant farmers, providing seeds, livestock, equipment, and credit. The Murashus absorbed the operational risk. If the harvest failed, they ate the loss. If it succeeded, they kept the spread between what they paid the Persian owner and what they collected from the land or the sublessee. This was not tenant farming. This was estate management as an entrepreneurial enterprise. The Murashus were intermediaries who turned other people's property into their own revenue stream without ever owning the underlying asset. The tablets reveal the mechanics. A typical lease specifies the canal, the acreage, the term, and the payment. One document records that a group of individuals approached Elilshum-Iddin, son of Murashu, and negotiated to lease the mayor's canal for 3 years, including the tithed field beside it and several marshes. The annual rent, 700 kur of barley, measured by Elilshum-Iddin's standard, plus 2 grazing bulls and 20 rams as gifts. The language is precise. The quantities are specific. This was not a handshake deal. It was a contract enforceable by law, documented on clay, sealed with cylinder impressions, filed in the family archive. The firm dealt with 2,500 separate individuals over its documented lifespan. That number comes from the onomasticon, the catalogue of names preserved in the tablets. These were not just wealthy Persians. They were Babylonians, West Semites, Egyptians, Jews who had remained in Mesopotamia after Cyrus allowed their return to Judea. The Murashu tablets show Hebrew names with the theophoric element Yahu, indicating Jewish clients who found life in Persian-controlled Nippur tolerable enough to stay and do business. One tablet records a dispute. Udana, son of Rahim Eli, a Jew, had property stolen by his brother and nephew. He brought his complaint to Bel-Nadan Shumu, one of the Murashu sons. The property was returned. No charges were filed. The parties agreed that no future generation would bring suit over the matter. This was conflict resolution as a service. The Murashus were not just landlords. They were adjudicators, intermediaries in social disputes that could escalate into blood feuds lasting generations. They monetized trust. They sold certainty in an uncertain world. This is the infrastructure of wealth. It is not glamorous. It is essential. The tablets also document tax collection. The Persian Empire needed revenue to fund armies, officials, and the royal court. Extracting that revenue from scattered farmers, soldiers on bouwlands, and workshop owners required administrative capacity the state did not have. The Murashus stepped in. They helped people pay their taxes and provide conscripts for military service. The firm would advance the funds a taxpayer needed, then collect repayment with interest, or they would contract directly with the state to collect a certain amount, pocketing the difference if their collections exceeded their obligation. This was tax farming before the term became standard, and it gave the Murashus the same advantage it gave the Ajibis in Babylon. They touched every economic actor. They saw who had liquidity problems before anyone else. That information asymmetry was monetizable. But the Murashus went further. The tablets reveal they obtained exclusive rights to use land they were not legally allowed to buy. This skirted the edge of legality. Persian law restricted foreign ownership of bouwlands to prevent the military fief system from collapsing. The Murashus found workarounds, long-term leases that functioned like ownership, subleasing arrangements that captured the economic value of land without holding title. Control without ownership. This required legal sophistication and relationships with officials willing to approve creative structures. It also required nerve. You do not build a fortune by staying within every line. You build it by understanding which lines can be blurred and which cannot. The family members sometimes traveled to Susa, the Persian capital, 200 kilometers from Nippur, where they would remain for months handling financial and legal business. These were not leisure trips. They were working sessions with Persian officials, contract negotiations, relationship maintenance. The Murashus understood that wealth at scale requires proximity to power centers. You cannot run an operation touching 2,500 counterparties from a single office in Nippur. You must be where decisions are made, where approvals are granted, where disputes are resolved. The Ejibis had learned this by embedding family members as royal judges. The Murashus learned it by travelling to the capital repeatedly, making themselves familiar, making themselves useful. The archive shows they were meticulous. The tablets are made of especially pure and soft clay, moulded and baked with greater care than usual. The inscriptions are in Akkadian, written in cuneiform, but at least 50 tablets also bear Aramaic endorsements inked or lightly incised on the surface. These summaries allowed officials who read Aramaic but not Akkadian to quickly understand the transaction without deciphering wedge marks. This was user experience design in 450 BCE. The firm understood that reducing friction for counterparties and officials increased throughput. The easier you make it for someone to do business with you, the more business you do. The tablets also include 657 different seal types, each one a unique identifier pressed into clay to authenticate a party's agreement. This was identity verification, fraud prevention, legal enforceability, all baked into clay and preserved for 24 centuries. Compare this to the House of Ejibi, operating in Babylon during roughly the same period, though starting earlier. Both families built fortunes by intermediating between resource owners and resource users. Both financed commodity flows. Both collected taxes for the state. Both documented every transaction with obsessive precision. But the differences matter. The Ejibis began a generation earlier and embedded themselves in the Neo-Babylonian state before the Persians arrived. When the regime changed, they were already indispensable. They served Nebuchadnezzar, then Cyrus, then Darius. The Murashus appeared during the mature Persian administration, after the system had stabilized. They served only Persian kings, and when the system shifted, they had no earlier regime to fall back on. The Ejibis managed property for soldiers who went to war. The Murashus leased land from Persians who did not want to live in Mesopotamia. The first model tied the family to military logistics. The second tied them to absentee landlords. The Ejibis collected taxes as a sideline to their core commodity and real estate business. The Murashus made tax collection and land leasing their primary operations, with credit extension as the lubricant. Both families understood the same principle. Wealth is built at the infrastructure layer, where essential functions happen regardless of who sits on the throne. But the Ejibis built broader. The Murashus built deeper in a narrower vertical. When that vertical collapsed, so did they. The tablets record that the firm dealt with matters concerning the less wealthy in Nippur's outer areas, but also with royalty. This is range. This is the ability to serve the Persian court and the struggling farmer with equal proficiency. The great commercial families understand that volume comes from the base of the pyramid, but leverage comes from the top. You need both. The Murashus cultivated both. The cuneiform documents show loans at high interest rates, land leases with complex terms, tax payments made on behalf of others, and the purchase and sale of goods for future delivery. These are not primitive transactions. These are sophisticated financial instruments, futures contracts, credit default swaps in embryonic form, the mechanics of modern finance, written in wedge marks on soft clay. What enabled this sophistication? The same thing that enabled the Ejibis: record keeping, legal enforceability, predictable contract law under Persian administration. The Achaemenid Empire, for all its flaws, provided a stable legal framework, across a vast territory. Disputes were adjudicated, contracts were honored, property rights, even when creatively structured, were generally respected. This allowed commercial families to plan decades ahead, to extend credit with reasonable confidence of repayment, to build enterprises that outlasted individual lifetimes. Wealth requires time. Time requires stability. Stability requires a government strong enough to enforce rules without being arbitrary enough to seize assets at will. The Persians, by maintaining Babylonian legal traditions and adding their own administrative capacity, created an environment where families like the Murashus could thrive. Then the environment changed. The tablets end around 403 BCE. The business appears to have been shut down or restructured by royal officials. Someone placed the tablets in storage, where they sat until excavation 23 centuries later. The archive does not tell us why the firm ended. It simply goes silent. Scholars speculate. Perhaps the Murashus' aggressive legal strategies finally crossed a line. Perhaps political shifts at the Persian court removed their protectors. Perhaps internal family disputes fragmented the operation. Perhaps the economics of the bowland system changed in ways that made their model obsolete. The clay does not say, but the timing is suggestive. The Murashu archive ends just as the Persian Empire enters its final century. The military defeats by Greece at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis had demonstrated Persian vulnerability. Internal court intrigues weakened central authority. Satraps became semi-independent. The administrative coherence that made commercial families possible began to fray. By the time Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 BCE, the empire was structurally intact but politically brittle. The Murashus were gone by then. They did not see the conquest. They did not have to adapt to yet another regime change. That task would fall to others. When Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BCE, after his victory at Gaugamela, he did not arrive as a destroyer of systems. He arrived as a pragmatist who understood that empires need administrators. The Babylonian priesthood, antagonized by the last Persian kings, welcomed him. He restored Marduk's temple. He appointed Mazaeus, a Persian, as satrap to ensure continuity. He adopted elements of Persian court ritual and dress to signal legitimacy to local elites. He understood what the Ajibis and Murashus had understood. Power flows through systems, and the people who understand those systems remain valuable regardless of who wears the crown. Alexander maintained the Achaemenid satrapy system. He kept most of the existing administrators in place, supplementing them with Macedonian generals only at the military level. He appropriated the immense Persian treasuries, but he did not immediately monetize all of it. Recent scholarship disputes the old narrative that Alexander's coinage stimulated a stagnant Persian economy. The truth is more complex. He was slow to change local currencies. He left the Persian financial infrastructure largely intact. The barter economies persisted. Land grants rather than cash payments remained the primary way to reward soldiers and attract colonists. The ancient economy was not ready for full monetization, and Alexander, whatever his other ambitions, did not force it. What Alexander did do was consolidate control over the world's wealthiest region and use its resources to fund further conquest. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, captured its treasury, then proceeded to Persepolis, where he eventually allowed his troops to loot and burn the ceremonial capital. This was symbolic destruction, not administrative. The systems that made the Persian Empire function, the canals, the roads, the legal frameworks, the tax collection mechanisms, were left operational because they were useful. Conquering armies need logistics. Logistics require local knowledge. Local knowledge resides in families and institutions that have been doing the work for generations. If a family like the Murashus had survived to see Alexander, they would have faced a choice. Adapt to the new ruler, as the Egyptes had adapted from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus. Position themselves as indispensable to Macedonian administrators who did not understand Mesopotamian agriculture or tax codes. Offer continuity in exchange for relevance, or resist, cling to Persian connections, and disappear when those connections were severed. The Egyptes survived regime change by being boring, by managing canals and collecting taxes and financing barley shipments, by being necessary rather than important. The Murashus, with their more aggressive legal strategies and narrower client base, may have lacked the flexibility to pivot. We cannot know. The tablets end before the question became urgent, but the principle survives. Wealth propagates when it attaches to essential functions: food production, water management, tax collection, credit extension. These needs do not change when kings change. The family or firm that controls these functions can offer services to any regime. This is not loyalty. This is utility. Empires come and go. Barley still needs to reach the city. Canals still need maintenance. Taxes still need collection. The entity that provides these services will find patrons, whether those patrons speak Akkadian, Persian, Greek, or any language yet to be invented. Money has no memory. It does not care who minted the coin or whose face decorates the palace. It follows returns. It accumulates where conditions allow accumulation, legal predictability, contract enforcement, property rights, and the ability to plan beyond the next harvest. The House of Agibi operated for over a century because they built systems that generated returns across regime changes. The House of Murashu operated for 50 years because they built systems optimized for a specific arrangement of power and law. When that arrangement shifted, their model broke. This is the lesson. Wealth built around one empire's quirks is fragile. Wealth built around human needs is portable. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE. His empire fractured immediately. His generals carved out kingdoms. The Seleucid Empire eventually controlled Mesopotamia, ruling from Antioch and Seleucia on the Tigris, not Babylon. The administrative center shifted. The language of government shifted from Aramaic and Akkadian to Greek. The legal codes evolved. The tax structures changed, yet the fundamental operations continued. Land was still leased. Crops were still financed. Water rights were still negotiated. The families that understood these operations found new patrons. The ones that did not faded into the clay tablets that archaeologists would dig up millennia later. The Murashus left behind 879 tablets. The Agibi's left 1,700. These numbers matter, not because more tablets mean more wealth, but because they represent the institutional memory of how wealth was made in the ancient world. Modern family offices use spreadsheets and cloud storage. Ancient families use clay and cuneiform. The medium changed, the function did not. Document every transaction. Track every obligation. Know what you own, what you owe, and what others owe you. Maintain these records with enough care that they survive your death. This is not philosophy. This is accounting. It is the least dramatic and most essential component of wealth that lasts. There is a continuity here that spans millennia. The House of Murashu leased land and collected taxes under Persian administration. The House of Agibi managed property and financed trade under Babylonian and Persian rule. Centuries later, the Medici in Florence would finance trade and collect papal taxes. Centuries after that, the Rothschilds would finance governments and manage currency flows. The names change, the languages change, the empires change. The underlying operations remain recognizable. Intermediation, information asymmetry, proximity to power, diversification across client bases, meticulous documentation. These are not secrets. They are patterns, visible to anyone who looks at the tablets and asks what they reveal about the mechanics of enduring wealth. What the Murashu tablets reveal is that wealth grows when you position yourself between a need and its fulfillment. Persian nobles needed their Babylonian estates managed without living there. Farmers needed credit to plant and tools to harvest. The state needed taxes collected without building a massive bureaucracy. The Murashus stood in the gap. They provided services others wanted, but could not easily provide for themselves. They captured value at the transaction point. They did this repetitively, systematically, across 2,500 counterparties and 50 years. That is the formula. That is what the clay tablets document in exhaustive, undeniable detail. The archive also reveals the limits. When the legal environment that enabled creative structures shifted, when the Persian officials who approved their arrangements were replaced, when the economic model built on bowlands and absentee landlords evolved, the firm ended. The tablets were placed in a room and forgotten. This is the other lesson. Wealth built on a specific regime's infrastructure is at risk when that regime falls. The Murashus thrived under mature Persian administration. They do not appear to have survived its decline. We do not have tablets from the Seleucid period bearing the Murashu name. Perhaps descendants continued under different structures. Perhaps the family dissolved. Perhaps they moved to Susa or Persepolis and restarted elsewhere. The clay does not tell us. Silence is also data. Compare this to the Ajibis, who survived from the late Babylonian period through the early Persian period, adapting as they went. They lasted longer because they diversified earlier and embedded deeper. They were not dependent on a single structural quirk like bowland leasing. They managed property, traded commodities, collected taxes, extended credit, invested in real estate, and served in government positions. When one revenue stream weakened, others compensated. When one regime ended, relationships with the next began before the transition completed. This is resilience through diversification. This is wealth that bends rather than breaks. The fall of Persia and the rise of Alexander represent one of history's hinge points. The world's political map was redrawn in a decade. For commercial families, the question was simple. Can you make yourself useful to the new order? If yes, you survive. If no, you become a footnote in someone's dissertation 24 centuries later. The Murashus could not, or did not. The mechanisms that would replace them, the Hellenistic banking houses and trading firms, would operate on similar principles. They would intermediate. They would collect information. They would finance trade and extend credit. They would maintain meticulous records. The techniques would be the same. Only the language and the currency would change. This is the pattern that transcends empires. Money does not care about borders or languages or gods. It cares about returns, enforceability, and the rule of law. When those conditions exist, wealth accumulates. When they break down, wealth disperses or flees. The House of Murashu existed in a sweet spot where Persian administration provided stability, Mesopotamian agriculture provided underlying value, and their intermediation services provided margin. They extracted that margin for 50 years. Then the conditions shifted and the extraction stopped. No moral judgment attaches to this. It is simply mechanics. Systems produce results until the conditions that made them effective change. Then new systems arise. Alexander's conquest ended the Achaemenid dynasty, but did not end the principles that made families like the Murashus and Ajibis successful. Those principles migrated. They appeared in Hellenistic Alexandria, in Roman Syria, in Byzantine Constantinople, in Abbasid Baghdad, in Venetian trade networks, in Florentine banking houses, in Dutch financial markets, in British imperial commerce. The names changed, the structures evolved, the core insight remained constant. Position at the infrastructure layer. Document everything. Diversify across clients. Maintain flexibility to serve new regimes. Separate the operations that generate wealth from loyalty to any particular ruler. This is how wealth survives when gods and kings do not. The 879 tablets of the Murashu archive sit now in museums. Philadelphia, Istanbul, London, Jena, scattered like the empire they documented. Scholars study them for insights into Persian administration, Mesopotamian agriculture, Jewish diaspora life, and the development of Aramaic script. But they are also a manual. They show how to build a fortune in an ancient economy. More importantly, they show the limits of that fortune when the supporting structures fail. They are a lesson in what endures and what does not. The tablets endure. The fortune did not. The principles that built the fortune, however, are still in use. That is how a family of wildcats in 5th century Nippur speaks to anyone building wealth today. The tools change. The rules remain. Position wisely. Document obsessively. Adapt or die. That is what the clay says, if you know how to read it.